You read first.
Yeah.
For Gotham.
Welcome to the Big Disaster Podcast. Today's topic. What?
Bro, already messed it up.
Shut up.
2 seconds in.
Okay. Welcome to the Big Disaster Podcast. Today's topic is Chernobyl. I'm one of your hosts, Robson Selko, and I'm here with
Sam Green
and
Alex Zedeker. Thank you to today's sponsor, Sports. Sports. Are you into sports? If not, pull up.
what sports?
Sports are a physical activity that millions of people do. There are many kinds of sports to choose from and many goals to achieve. Some of the sports include soccer, basketball, football, hockey, lacrosse, and many more. Sports also have many events all over the calendar. Also, sports are played all over the globe. There is a global sense of community when you play sports. Thanks to today's sponsor, and back to the podcast.
I have a question for you guys. Do you think people should be held responsible for their actions in a survival situation?
Well, I believe in some situations people should be held responsible because of an incident I read about called Chernobyl. Did you know that Chernobyl was a nuclear power plant located in Russia that was used from 1977 to 1986, and it was used to power the town of Pripyat and surrounding places?
Isn't that the disaster that caused hundreds of people to lose their homes and long-lasting damage to occur in the miles surrounding the plant?
Nuh-uh. It's thousands of people that lost their homes.
Whatever, it's the same thing.
There's a significant difference between hundreds and thousands.
It sounds like the effect was big on people.
It was big. The plant had a huge effect on the zones surrounding the plant, and Russia tried to hide what was happening to prevent fear of the nearby countries.
Fear of what?
Fear of people finding out about the disaster. This is one of the worst nuclear meltdowns in history, after all, and it caused safety standards to be increased in plants to prevent this from happening again.
What caused the plant to melt down?
The plant's safety was shut down due to a test being performed. They disabled the emergency shutoff. The plant's power was turned down to see if it was able to provide through to enough only power the emergency cooling pumps.
It sounds like the people in charge of the plant are responsible for the disaster.
I would agree, but unknown to the plant operators, running the reactor at reduced power allowed a buildup of ion gases inside the core. As they prepared the reactor for the test, its power dropped to dangerously low levels. In response, operators removed all but 18 of the reactor's 211 control rods in hopes of raising the power. It did not work, of course, but I would not say it was entirely their fault.
That makes sense, but on the contrary, at around 1 a.m., the plant seemed to be stabilized, and they continued with the test at 1:23 a.m. The cooling pumps were then disabled, and the plant went through a huge power spike. So a worker pressed the emergency shutoff switch, but the graphite rods that were supposed to drop into the plant on their own failed to drop and jammed in the top. The plant then went through two massive explosions, one that blew the roof off and another that threw radioactive material into the air. And this means that things went wrong at first. They just continued the test and went back to normal, which then caused the disaster.
Also, the scope of the disaster became apparent. The authorities relented and evacuated the town 36 hours after the explosion. In the weeks that followed, the Soviets would also evacuate an additional 115,000 people from the region. Eventually, the figure would rise to 200,000.
Anyway, 2 days after the nuclear incident, Northern Europe found high levels of radiation in the air, leading the Soviet Union to admit to the accident. They then organized a mass cleanup effort involving hundreds of thousands of people who removed buried contaminated materials that surrounded the plant. By November of 1986, they built a contaminated structure around the reactor called a sarcophagus, and in 2016, they remodeled and made a more advanced version.
The official death toll from the Chernobyl disaster recognized by the Soviet Union is 31. This includes 2 workers who died in the explosion and 28 who died later from radiation exposure. Additionally, the chief of the plant's fire department, who died of cancer in 2002, was also recognized as a casualty of Chernobyl. However, experts believe the actual death toll is much higher, with an estimated range of 54 to potentially thousands of deaths from radiation-related illnesses. Some projects projections suggest up to 200,000 people may have eventually died from cancer caused by Chernobyl. But these figures are difficult to verify.
The people in the situation should be held responsible because it was their fault and because of bad communication and lack of experience.
How are they responsible for an error in the plant that they couldn't stop?
The plant was supposed to be shut down during the day to test the safety of the plant and if it can power itself in certain situations.
Well, why was this not just a routine test? What made it different from the other tests that they had done?
The plant was supposed to be shut down in the daytime so they disabled some of the emergency safety measures that were not turned back on. Then the plant's test was delayed until later that night because they wanted to keep the power on the grid for the daytime.
Then what happened to the plant that made it explode? Even without the safety, what caused it to blow up, and why didn't anyone notice or do anything about it?
They didn't know that the emergency shutoff was disabled.
Then, when they turned the plant's power down and without their knowledge, a buildup of xenon gas occurred. Since the emergency systems were off, they didn't know about this caused the plant's power to drop, so they pulled all but 18 of the 211 rods, but the gas acted as a damper and didn't allow it to rise.
What happened in the plant that made it explode so violently?
Well, they later thought they stabilized the plant, so they turned off the emergency cooling pumps, and then the plant went through a massive power spike, and when they pressed the emergency shutoff, it dropped every graphite rod they jammed, and the plant went nuclear.
What happened when the plant went nuclear?
That means that the power went above its terminal temperature and continues to heat until the entire plant melts. There were two following explosions, one that took the roof off and one that shot all the radioactive material everywhere in the surrounding area.
What did they do after?
They immediately tried to contain all the fire and materials that escaped and then keep the people in surrounding places safe from the fallout. Dog, that's wild.
Okay, hold on.
So basically, there's lack of communication and knowledge of the workers that caused the plant to become unstable and cause mass damage to surrounding areas.
So do you think they're responsible for what happened?
Yes, I do think they're responsible for what happened. They should have had better communication with both shifts and re-enable the emergency system after the test was delayed.
Yes, I do. Chernobyl is a perfect example of the situation where the people should be held accountable for their actions.
This reminds me of a podcast named Call for Help, which was about a family that was stranded at sea. Because that was another situation that people thought they were responsible for what happened and that they should have dealt with their consequences of their actions and not have other people pay for it. And the podcast host, Ira Glass, said their baby daughter, Lyra, was sick. Now, contrary to what you might have read or heard about this part of the story, if you followed the story at all, the baby was not sick when they started the trip.
Yeah, they were the ones that caused their kids to become sicker than they needed to become, and then they delayed the call for help because they wanted to save their livelihood, which was them living on the boat.
Yes, I read about that. The family said they prepared the best they could, even postponing the trip because their daughter being sick before the trip.
So we are all in agreement that depending on the situation, it would say if the person should be responsible?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you all for listening to the Big Disaster Podcast, and don't forget to pull up when it comes to sports.
Dun,
Roll credits!
dun, 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 dun.